They weren't after my boat ramp alone. What they really wanted was control over the entire lake, one shoreline parcel at a time. When the HOA board decided they could simply take land that legally belonged to someone else, they had no clue they were setting themselves up to lose lake access completely. This is how it all unfolded. But before I get into it, let me know where you're watching HOA Revenge Stories from. Leave your country in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if you haven't subscribed to HOA Revenge Stories yet, now's the perfect time. Hit that subscribe button because what happens next only gets more unbelievable. For this story, my name isn't the important part. The real focus is a narrow stretch of property my grandfather purchased back in 1968, years before anyone imagined building an upscale lakeside neighborhood there. In those days, the area was nothing but dense woods, open water, and a rough dirt trail leading to the shore. My grandfather built a simple wooden boat ramp so our family could launch fishing boats without hauling them through thick mud every weekend. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't expensive, but it belonged to us. Half a century later, everything around that quiet shoreline had changed. The forest disappeared, replaced by a gated subdivision with almost 400 homes, all governed by a powerful homeowners association. My property, with its old boat ramp, ended up sitting right in the center of the development like a tiny island that had never joined the neighborhood, surrounded by perfectly trimmed lawns, decorative fences, and identical mailboxes. For a long time, nobody seemed to care. I paid my property taxes every year, maintained my land, and stayed out of HOA business. I was never part of the association because my grandfather's deed existed decades before the community was ever planned, and our parcel had never been legally added to the HOA. The problem was that new homeowners never bothered learning the history. They looked at a private boat ramp sitting on a lake everyone admired and simply assumed it belonged to the neighborhood. Then a newly elected HOA board came along with bigger ambitions. They wanted another luxury feature they could advertise to attract buyers, and my boat ramp became the centerpiece of their plan. At first, everything seemed harmless. Neighbors casually mentioned how nice it would be if everyone could use the ramp. Conversations at the mailbox slowly shifted toward community lake access. A few people even asked whether I had ever considered letting the association manage it. I smiled politely and changed the subject. What I didn't realize was that those conversations weren't random. I had already become their next target. The first official move came in the mail. A certified envelope arrived with the HOA's logo printed across the top. Surprisingly, they even spelled my name correctly. Inside was a formal notice claiming my boat ramp fell within a shared lake easement and that, under community bylaws, every access point to the lake should be controlled and maintained by the Homeowners Association for safety, insurance, and liability reasons. In plain English, they wanted my property. I called the phone number listed on the letter. The woman who answered sounded calm and professional, as though she'd delivered the same speech dozens of times before. She explained that the board had voted to request that I transfer maintenance rights for the ramp to the HOA. Not purchase it, not lease it, simply give it to them. At first I laughed. A few seconds later, I wasn't laughing anymore. I opened the fireproof lockbox in my closet and pulled out my grandfather's original property deed. That document had survived multiple moves and even a house fire. I read every page carefully. The language couldn't have been clearer. The land belonged to my family. The boat ramp belonged to my family. There wasn't a single sentence mentioning any shared easement or HOA ownership. I mailed back a respectful but direct reply. No. 2 weeks later, another certified letter showed up. This one dropped the friendly tone. The board claimed a community lake access agreement gave them authority over the shoreline. They argued my ramp was the only practical launch point on that side of the lake and warned they were fully prepared to seek legal action if I refused to cooperate. I assumed they were trying to intimidate me. At least, that's what I believed then. What I didn't know was that this wasn't their first attempt. The board had pressured other property owners before, and many of them had eventually given in. They expected me to follow the same pattern. That wasn't going to happen. This is where everything took an unexpected turn. The board had overlooked something that would eventually destroy their entire plan. Instead of arguing through letters, I attended the next HOA board meeting. When the developer built the subdivision during the 1990s, they never actually purchased those shoreline access rights. They simply assumed the rights automatically transferred with the surrounding land. They didn't. That single mistake changed everything. Legally speaking, the HOA didn't truly own access to the lake at all. For decades, the neighborhood had operated under the belief that its docks, walking paths, and launch areas were protected by community easements. In reality, many of those easements trace back to my family's original parcel. My boat ramp wasn't just another private launch site. It was one of the few fully documented, legally recognized access points serving that entire side of the lake. I sat alone in my truck outside the county recorder's office, reading the water rights filing again and again. Once, twice, 3 times. I kept expecting to find something I'd misunderstood. I never did. The HOA board, so determined to take my little wooden ramp, had unknowingly triggered a title investigation that exposed a legal flaw sitting unnoticed for decades. Their certified letters, their threats of lawsuits, their public announcement that they intended to seize my property. Every one of those actions created a paper trail showing they were fully aware my land carried unique access rights and still attempted to claim them anyway. That same week, I hired an experienced real estate attorney. She spent several hours reviewing every deed, survey, easement, and county filing I had collected. When she finally closed the last folder, she smiled and said something I'll always remember. They've just handed you all the leverage you could ever ask for. Now the only question was how to use it. I requested time to speak at the next HOA board meeting. The board quickly approved my request. I'm sure they believed I was finally coming to negotiate. Maybe they expected me to compromise. Maybe they expected me to surrender. They couldn't have been more wrong. When meeting night arrived, nearly 300 homeowners filled the room. I walked to the front, placed my documents on the podium, and calmly explained exactly what I had discovered. I read directly from the official county water rights records. Then I explained what those records actually meant. The association's docks, the lakeside walking trails, the common launch areas, even several of the paths residents had been using for almost 30 years. None of them existed because the HOA owned the shoreline. They existed because easements connected to my grandfather's original property had quietly allowed access all along. You could actually feel the atmosphere in the room change. People stopped whispering. They started paying attention. I continued by explaining that my attorney had already filed formal legal notice. From that point forward, continued use of those shoreline access points without a properly negotiated agreement could legally be viewed as trespassing on documented private water access rights. The HOA president immediately jumped to her feet. She insisted there had to be some misunderstanding. She questioned whether the county filings were even valid. I didn't argue. Instead, I handed complete copies of the recorded documents to the meeting moderator so they could be distributed throughout the room. Then I delivered the sentence I'd been waiting weeks to say. You didn't just try to take my boat ramp. You accidentally uncovered the fact that this entire neighborhood was built around a lake it never legally secured access to. For several seconds, nobody said a word. Then the room exploded. Homeowners began firing questions at the board from every direction. How had this happened? Why wasn't it discovered when the community was built? Who approved the development? What would this do to home values? Could residents actually lose lake access? The board president's face turned bright red. Unable to answer the growing number of questions, she abruptly ended the meeting and hurried the board members out of the room. I wasn't interested in revenge for revenge's sake, and I wasn't about to solve their problem for nothing. Instead, I made a single proposal. I offered the HOA a professionally drafted easement agreement prepared by my attorney. The agreement would permanently guarantee legal access to the lake through my property, but it would happen entirely on my terms. The document included strict legal protections for my land. It confirmed my ownership rights beyond dispute, and it required the HOA to permanently withdraw every claim against my boat ramp. Negotiations dragged on for 4 long months. There were countless letters, multiple attorney meetings, several revisions, plenty of arguments. But in the end, the board had nowhere else to turn. Without a signed easement from me, every dock, every pathway, and every shared shoreline access point the community had depended on for decades remained legally vulnerable. Residents weren't angry with